Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. There have been some interesting political and economic movements this week. Economic indicators are up, while support for the government is down. Now, as we know, typically support for the government goes up when consumer confidence goes up. This week, the economic and political indicators have diverged. Support for the Albanese government is down, not because we're worried about economic issues, but due to a drop in preference flow from supporters of other parties and independents. In particular, this includes a lower preference flow from the Greens, as the two parties disagree on several key policy areas, like housing strategy. The Greens have blocked the passage of Labor's $10 billion social housing bill in the Senate. A rent freeze. The Greens have called for a 2-year rent freeze to deal with soaring housing costs for renters. And the Greens are calling for an across-the-board increase to JobSeeker, while the ALP has only committed to an increase for Australians aged 55 plus. In terms of primary support, the ALP was virtually unchanged this week, but the coalition increased its primary support by 2 percentage points. And this was reflected in the two-party preferred result, with the ALP on 53.5%, down 3% on a week ago, compared to the coalition on 46.5%. In line with the drop in overall support, government confidence has fallen again, down 1 point to 89.5. Now 47% of Australians say the country is heading in the wrong direction, and only 36.5% say the country is going in the right direction. As mentioned earlier, consumer economic indicators improved this week. The ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Rating was up 1.8 points to 79.8, ahead of the Reserve Bank interest rate decision today and next week's federal budget. Lower than expected inflation numbers from the ABS last week, suggesting there may be no Reserve Bank interest rate increase today, would have helped consumer confidence. The Reserve Bank's decision today will clearly have an impact on what happens to consumer confidence over the next week. But of course, at 79.8 this week, although it's up a little, consumer confidence is still below 80 and has now been below 80 for 9 straight weeks since early March. Inflation expectations have continued to fall. This week, Australians expect annual inflation of 5% over the next 2 years. This is down 0.3% in a week, the lowest they've been since early January. And the fall in inflation expectations follows the lower than expected ABS CPI reading last week. CPI fell from 7.8% in the December quarter to 7% for the March quarter, and down to 6.3% in the month of March. These falling CPI figures have continued to follow the ANZ Roy Morgan inflation expectation figures, which peaked in November 2022 and have fallen significantly over the last 6 months. Now turning to our neighbours across the ditch. New Zealand faces an election in 5 months' time. New Labor Prime Minister Chris Hipkins versus National Party leader Christopher Luxon, and the gap is narrow. Support for a potential national ACT-NZ coalition is 44.5% in April, and still just ahead of the governing Labor-Greens coalition on 42%, both down. The key factor is the growing level of support for minor parties. Now 13.5% support other parties. That's the highest in this term of Parliament. Support for other parties includes 4.5% support for both the Maori Party and NZ First in April, with both well within the range of winning seats in the next Parliament. There's a further 4.5% who support other minor parties, including Democracy New Zealand, the Opportunities Party, and the New Conservative Party. On present trends, the Maori Party and perhaps New Zealand First are in the box seat to determine who will be New Zealand's Prime Minister later this year, Chris or Christopher. And now turning to an issue that's of vital importance to all of us. And if it's not important to you, it should be. The division of unpaid domestic labour. Roy Morgan has partnered with the Melbourne Institute to inform Australian economic and social policy in a partnership known as Taking the Pulse of the Nation, or TTPN. As part of this TTPN partnership, Roy Morgan surveyed over 1,000 Australian adults during the month of March about their unpaid domestic work, including activities like grocery shopping, food preparation, laundry, caring for grounds and gardening, home and vehicle maintenance, caring for children, caring for adults, and paying bills. The finding is that women do almost 8 hours more unpaid domestic work than men in an average week. So Australian women do an average of 23.1 hours each week, over 3 hours per day of unpaid domestic work, compared to an average of 15.3 hours per week for men, just over 2 hours a day. And it's not just that men are more likely to be undertaking full-time work than women. Even among women and men in full-time employment, there's still a significant difference. Women in full-time work do 17.4 hours a week of unpaid domestic work, 3.6 hours a week more than men in full-time work, who do an average of 13.8 hours per week. That's an extra half an hour every day of unpaid domestic work that women do every day. When children are present in the household, 71% of women say their partner does less domestic unpaid work than them. And 59% of men report their partner doing more. This reminds me of the first survey I ever did. We found 7 in 10 Australians drinking less than the average. Go figure. Regardless, these results suggest that there's more that men of Australia can do to even the ledger on the home front. And stepping up, spending more time helping around the house would certainly be greatly appreciated by many millions of Australian women. There's a lot more detail associated with these results, and if you're interested, you can have a look at the Roy Morgan website and the Melbourne Institute for more extensive analytic and in-depth view of the findings. Before we leave you for this week, there's news today that Qantas has appointed a new CEO, Vanessa Hudson, to take the top job at the airline in November. This decision follows a plunge in the Roy Morgan net trust ratings in recent months for Qantas. Will this be the opportunity Qantas needs to reverse its toxic levels of distrust that have soared under the outgoing CEO, Alan Joyce? And that's a wrap for this week. Subscribe free to our Roy Morgan YouTube channel for all the latest political, economic and market research data and insights. And thanks for listening today. Take care and see you next Tuesday.